All right. Welcome. My name is Martin. I work at Media Evolution, and I'm just here to say welcome once more to our space and to the lunch conversation that we're going to listen to between Björn Jeffery from Svenska Dagbladet and David Larsson Heidenblad from Lund University. So please give them a warm welcome with your hands, perhaps. Good. And I'll keep the microphone so that we can capture some questions as well, if you have those during the conversation.
Absolutely, thank you. Welcome to the first of this three-part series on Silicon Valley knowledge. My name is Björn Jeffery. I am a former entrepreneur and former resident of Silicon Valley during about 8 years, a few years ago. And with me on stage, I have David. Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much, Björn. I am an historian from a nearby city here, and I study Silicon Valley history and knowledge, and have gotten to know Björn through mutual acquaintances. And very much look forward to this. We have done something similar in more or less like a closed setting.
Yes, we cheated and did. This was the long academic version that took half a day,
Yeah.
with a lot of academics going back sort of, I used to study this in the 90s and it took many, many hours. So this is a very, very condensed version of that. Extremely condensed to about 40 minutes. The title, I guess, suggests that there's something either missing or something to be learnt from Silicon Valley, even if you're not necessarily in it. So I thought let's spend a few minutes talking about why are we here and why are all these books here. You're the librarian of the day. You brought almost all these books. Give us a sort of a short overview of what we're trying to cover here before we go into the specifics.
Yeah, I think these are my books, and I fell into them, I think, over the last 10 years or so. And it took me a while to realize that they were all from the same geographic space. It was, to me, was like just some kind of business books about startups and stuff, but a lot of it is like a clustered around Silicon Valley, and it's like a literary canon, which I'm sure there are some of you here that knows it by heart. But when I show these books to my to other contemporary historians, for example, or to journalists, most people have barely heard of them. Like a few years ago, few had heard of Peter Thiel. Now they know him, but most have not read the books.
A lot of people have strong opinions about him, but have not necessarily read what he's written.
No, exactly. And as an historian, I mean, we are text types. We read a lot of books, and I have found it fascinating that, like, the digital transformation, at its heart, there is a lot of physical books, and there's also a lot of what we see here today, like analog meeting sites, people having like conferences and stuff. So like if you study Silicon Valley history, then there are, like in the cluster, we have people like Stuart Brand, for example, have these like make conferences where they connect like artists and entrepreneurs and academics and stuff like that. And that is, I think, Björn, you gave me that book, Uncanny Valley, a couple of years ago. It's a memoir of sorts of a woman who leaves the publishing industry in New York to work in Silicon Valley. And she has this quote that she says that when I lived in New York, I could like almost not think of the internet as being made by people. And when I am in Silicon Valley, I cannot think of the internet as something not made by people. That kind of difference, which I think might be even stronger if you live like in a country in Northern Europe, where a lot of these things happens somewhere else. But once you go there, and as you go in all worlds, it's just people.
Yeah, I think you're an interesting you have an interesting take on this, considering that you're not in the Silicon Valley space, but still interested in what can be drawn from it, so to speak. I think a lot of people within Silicon Valley, or even in the tech space, love these sorts of things, and they reference to, they reference the literature, they reference the ideas very fluently. But you're finding this as someone from the outside of the tech industry, which I think gives you an interesting perspective. You even famously have an analog calendar, which is that's a historical artifact if I've ever heard one. But Why are we listening to a man with an analog calendar that to tell us about the most developed technology
Well, I guess it's
area
good.
in the world?
I guess it's good marketing that you're all here today, and if you are here for the next couple of conversations because we said something interesting. But I think like my unique selling point in this is that I read books, and I read a lot of them. And if I find a book and it references to another book, then I read that book as well. So that's sort of how historians work, and it's very natural to me. But I have learned by learning people, it's not natural outside my discipline, I'd say. And like following your curiosity, that's a lot about what academic scholarship is. And I also, I think in time, I mean, we all live in time, but most people who are not historians do not always think in time that much. You don't think like in which sequence did what happen, what changed when, how did it happen, etc. And so like these books, like when we first started talking about them, to me, like one of the most interesting things is like, how does something become part of this canon, and how does it survive? How come we read this book, like Only the Paranoid Survive, is always in print. It's from 1995. The last chapter is about, is the internet gonna change things or not? Or is it very, that's quite dated. But the book is not dated. Like the ideas is about how you navigate change and how you adjust that. And that is a timeless topic. So what makes something timeless, or what makes someone pick up a book written 40 or 50 years ago and use it to build their company or to make decisions? I find that interesting. So like the longevity of knowledge, I think interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's a perspective that we had in these first conversations too, that the technology itself ages quite badly. This is about Intel. Intel, famously for those who follow technology news, if you've read the book, it is a work of absolute perfect irony, because what just happened to Intel this past year is exactly what the book is about from 30 or 40 years earlier, saying don't do this because then this is going to happen. That's exactly what happened to Intel, and that was the CEO of Intel that wrote the book. So there is irony there, but the technology itself ages, and Intel in this case aged very badly in the context of what they should be doing, but the knowledge around this does not age very badly. As you say, it's still very relevant. And something that we also discussed, which is interesting, is wherever you go, you can go across the street here to Mink and listen to the startup pitches. You could go to Krakow, you could go to New York. All the terminology in these books will recur. You will hear the same thing. You'll see people talking about the lean startup, which is one of the books which is on the list, a minimum viable product, all this sort of terminology. Everybody knows these things, they heard about it, but where did they come from? And why did these things stick as opposed to all the other books that are written? Because you have a larger bookshelf than what is represented on stage. What happened there? So why is history sort of a useful lens to try to pick this apart before we dive into the books itself?
I think one important part is that knowledge has some kind of time frame of it, and what is known at one point in time is not. When you put these things in a chronological sequence, you realize that certain things happen at certain points in time. Like a lot of the things which are of these books, like 0 to 1 or the Lean Startup, which are ubiquitous today. It's very easy, if you start to read these books from the 90s or these books from the 80s, there's a lot of concepts who are not there. For example, or surrounding network effects or something like that, or iterations. It's not there. So at some point in time, someone must have learned something which was useful. When did that happen? How did that happen? How did it spread? Those are the questions that historians delve into, and which of course shows that these things are very much, they do have a history.
But not a very formalized history.
Not a very formalized history. No, definitely not. As most historians, historians are always late to the party, and few are interested in money and technology, and therefore a lot of this is in a dead angle from an historian point of view. While I'd say that this knowledge culture, you could call it, is very forward-looking. It's what's happening now, what will happen next. It's very much future-oriented. Which makes, I think, it easy to forget that things have a history, and that you can learn things from that history. And I don't know exactly what we can learn and how we can learn it, and that's part of I think that is says. I mean, research is about not knowing things. Because if you already know it, then you don't have to do any research. Then you can just pick a book off the shelf. But here, like at the stage I'm in now, you know, when I've gotten some kind of start getting some funding, been working some years, reading some books, trying to get a question. I mean, it takes time. Historical research takes like 5 to 10 years until you can say something interesting. And
that's why we invited you here on the day, the first day, where we have nothing interesting to say.
We'll see. But these things have to. It's a minimal viable product, and you have to sort of iterate it in. That's one of the things I've learned, I'd say, from being an historian for like 20 years almost, is that the quicker you sort of put your ideas into the open, then things start to happen. So for example, I wrote a text last week in Svenska Dagbladet about Apple and Apple's entry into China. There was a big book coming last fall about how Apple's and China's got intertwined. And then I think it was 23:55 or something like that, I got an SMS on my phone from a person who said, what's your email address? And I said, okay. And me and my wife and the kids woke up, and I sent him my email address, and the next day I got it, and I wondered, who was that? And I don't know, it was a random number, I don't know. And it was a man, 84 years old, who had been working at Saab since the mid-60s, and who had been in Silicon Valley in the early 80s and found the text very interesting and wanted, do you want to have a chat about these things? And so now tomorrow I have this booked meeting. I don't know what will come out of that, but I do not know his history. And I think I can find interesting things about these things. And that's what, as a contemporary historian, that is part of sort of the trade, I think, to sort of expose ideas, to get people to sort of come to you, and then you see, and sometimes interesting things happen.
I did a live podcast a few weeks ago, and then a guy showed up with the original smartphone. Not a smartphone, but the smartphone, before that was even a thing. The first time those words were ever put together was an Ericsson phone, and he brought it. Like, this is the smartphone. That's how they marketed it. Of course, the beginning of a whole thing. And he was the guy who developed that, among many others, obviously, but he was one of them, and he brought it with him, just as an example of the serendipity that can appear when you come out there.
Yeah.
But we've promised to dive into the books. Yes. Let's do this. Let's start with the top one. A well-known 0 to 1. How many have read it? 1. Okay. Well, this is homework for next week. Okay. So this is a book written by Peter Thiel and Blake Masters, who is now these days, I think, I was going to say he's a senator, but I think he tried to become a senator, and I'm not sure that he actually succeeded or not. I can't remember. So let's give some background just as an example of something which has spread extremely fast and was not even really intended as a book originally. Give us some context.
I think you should should tell this
I'll
story.
give some context then.
You were in Silicon Valley when this book
I think so.
gain traction, right?
I got this before this was a book. This was a computer course at Stanford University. I believe it was CS 183. It was the name of the course, Computer Science 183. I got it as a PDF, a badly marked up PDF that was doing the rounds. Which was then Blake Masters, the co-author in this case, was a student in the class Computer Science 183, and he took a lot of extremely elaborate notes on this class that Peter Thiel was holding in entrepreneurship. That was the idea of the class, and in a computer science setting at Stanford University in Palo Alto. And these notes, I'd say they became viral in its old school sense. This PDF was sent back and forth, and it's like, this is some unbelievable stuff.
And when are we in time here, Björn?
This must be early 2010, 2011, somewhere there in those. This goes somewhat viral. Peter Thiel is a well-known character prior to this. He's a co-founder of PayPal, among many other things. He was then a prominent venture capitalist, shows up in many different sets. Now you've seen him probably together with Trump on stage at the RNC and things like that. But before he became explicitly political, he was indirectly political anyway, but he was more of just a venture capitalist and an ideas man of sorts. And then since this PDF went viral, basically, this then turned into a book, which is a little bit more formalized. But if you read the original PDF, which is probably have in some Dropbox folder somewhere, you would find something very similar to what this is. It's slightly more structured. But it's a good example of something where A, it was not intended as a book, but it is also a form of knowledge sharing that was in a classroom in Silicon Valley, which has now become sort of the, I don't know, a startup, staple, you could call, in any sort of entrepreneurial environment. You, at least if you haven't read it, you've probably heard of it, and people reference this and the ideas in it very briefly. For those who haven't read it, what can one find in this?
Yeah, I think the basic idea of it is that like the hard thing is to make something new, to make something that does exist. To go from 0 to 1 is much harder than to go from 1 to 100 or 1 to 1,000. It's like getting traction on something that is really, really hard. I'd say that's one of the things.
Yeah.
And also, it's a lot about the future being malleable, I'd say. That people who just sort of anticipate, I mean, it's possible to create. This book says that it's possible to create it. And I know because I've done it. And these are the things that I believe work best, sort of.
And he has some pretty controversial ideas as well. I think I wrote in Svenska Dagbladet the other day about this specifically, where there's this idea in the startup community where Silicon Valley is this place where everybody just helps each other. They're spreading of knowledge all the time. Everybody's super friendly. There's introductions being sent back and forward. If you read this book from one of the most prominent people in Silicon Valley, that is absolutely not the message of this book. What he talks about is creating local monopolies. Is like what you don't want is competition.
Yeah.
That is essentially what this book is saying.
Yeah.
Do not have, under any circumstances, create anything where anyone can compete. Because as soon as you compete with something, the only thing that happens is that your margins slowly get eroded. I'll build one car, you build another one. You do one slightly cheaper, then I'll do one slightly cheaper. You do one slightly better, then I'll do one slightly better, but then my costs increase. And gradually, we're fighting each other to extinction. So what you should try to do, and his example of this is Google, is try to create a company that has no competition and create a local monopoly where you cannot compete essentially with them. And once you do that, you can start messing about with other things.
Yeah, you should also show that the Google example is that, I mean, you are a monopoly in search, but then you have a lot of other things which says to the regulators that you are not a monopoly.
Exactly.
We do cars.
Exactly. We do all sorts
we do glass.
Yeah, we have 20% innovation time. We think about new cool stuff all the time. Like, sure, but 90% of your money comes from an unregulated monopoly.
And to create a monopoly is, of course, the idea that you should not compete.
Yeah.
And he has this quote in it when he says that if you can recognize competition as a sign of not value or something like that, then you are more sane than most. Like a lot of people in competitive fields think that competition is something good. I mean, in academia, certainly people love to compete to become professor at the most prestigious university, but that is not what that does not make business sense. You should try to go for the low, where no one else is going.
Yeah.
That's the contrarian style, of course, like to be contrarian and be right, but at least like to shun competition, which is, and yeah, it's not what you're taught in all places.
It's probably not what you're taught anywhere, I think. And that's what I think is so interesting about it. Whether it's right or wrong, you can discuss it, and you could also discuss, is this a net positive for society to have a bunch of people trying to create local monopolies where no one else can contribute? You could definitely argue that is a bad thing. Not if you're running it. Then you can look at just Google's profit margins and say easily, this is a very good thing if you're a Google shareholder. Everybody else, maybe not so much. Because they got there in a space which wasn't in a vacuum either, of course. They were not the first ones, which is another sort of a startup myth that I think comes from out of Silicon Valley a lot, which is the first mover advantage. Something, again, a reference that everybody knows of. Google was not first to search. Not even close.
In this book, it's the concept of last mover that is sort of what you should aim for.
Yeah. So that's also sort of a myth that's survived itself somehow. This book clearly says, don't do that. I mean, Alta Vista, Yahoo Search, Ask.com, all of these search engines were the basis of where this came from. They were clearly before Google, many, many years before Google, and now are, they will now become a footnote in your research one day, but but nothing else than that, because no one ever uses Alta Vista.
No.
anymore.
And the book also, Björn, I think, I mean, shows the creation of it is also interesting in itself. It's like the thing that Peter Thiel at this time, like a venture capitalist, someone who had made things, then you get invited to university and you teach a course. That is, at least in my departments in the humanities, that does never happen. It's the roads between academia and other parts of society are much sharper, I'd say, in the Swedish. So we don't invite our alums to teach our students in that sense, but that is a part of like the fluid thing of Silicon Valley, and where Stanford has this research park outside. I mean, you have tried to create the same thing in Lund, for example, with Ideon, which is sort of exactly, it's mimicked on the science park idea in the Stanford model, but it doesn't work if people don't like cross over. But that is part of that kind of knowledge culture, where like, and also that the founder of PayPal or co-founder then becomes a venture capitalist. That is also a typical part of the Silicon Valley culture, where people sort of move through different, like in one part you're the founder, in a later stage in life you are the investor, like, and that has been the case for quite some decades.
And also interesting that these sort of people are extremely influential. I mean, Peter Thiel, obviously PayPal, influential company. He was also one of the first investors in Facebook, and was on Facebook's board for many, many years. Anyone who's followed the development of Facebook over the last few years has been directly influenced by Peter Thiel and what he wrote in this book. This is his basic philosophy. This is how he views how companies should be built. When he is the mentor of Mark Zuckerberg, this affects us all, but it starts in this classroom in the sort of the early 2010s somewhere as a course notes for something completely different, which is an interesting idea.
And if we jump back and if we do like a little timeline of
this,
let's do that. If you take this book and the things that are like sort of the truth, and here are like the knowledge, the things that people regard as knowledge in many places and put to use, there's a lot of it that you won't find here in like these 90s books.
But this is catalog. This is
we have this catalog here of like, this is like I think 2010 and onwards. Here we have 1990s and here 1980s.
So walk us through here.
Should we go back to the beginning?
Go back to the beginning. Just sort of what do we talk about at different decades?
Should we talk about this one first? Have anyone read this book, In Search of Excellence? This is like the first major big I'd say global business book bestseller. På jakt efter mästerskapet.
I was going to say, this was translated to
Swedish.
Yes,
of course it was translated, because back in those days, like, that's how you got hold of books. Either you like if you read like accounts of people, academics in the 80s and 90s, and they go to US, then they buy books and take them home, because that's how you got the books to Sweden. I mean, they were not in the bookstores. It was hard to get things. Not that long ago. But this book became, and these two were two McKinsey consultants based in the Valley. One of the co-researchers here were also Jim Collins, Good to Great, who wrote sort of the second wave of big books. That is also these like internal networks of people who met people and who knew people. It's a much smaller world once you dig into it than if you just look on the shelf. And this, I'd say, is why a lot of universities today strive for excellence and have excellence strategies and stuff like that. The idea in this striving for excellence. And other part here is another one by Andy Grove, who also wrote this Only the Paranoid Survive. This is like Intel's legendary CEO and chairman.
Extremely successful at the time.
Extremely successful at the time, and it's about like leadership and stuff like that. And Intel, of course, and Intel is very interesting. Both these books are very interesting, because Intel in the beginning of the 80s, they did memory chip. So they had like memory was like, I don't know, 99.5% of what they did. And then they had this small division of microprocessors, which didn't really matter to the bottom line. But in the 80s, then the Japanese sort of undercut the memory business. And Intel decided to jump ship in the mid-80s. So they forfeited their memory chips, and they went all in on the microprocessors. And that is the only the Paranoid Survive thing. That like even the things that take you to the top, you should be willing to abandon it if the sort of economic things changes. Sort of that is sort of the thing that they teaches.
And this is of course what Intel did not do.
They
stuck with the CPUs. When Nvidia said, what about GPUs?
Yeah.
And put everything on that, and then Intel was left in the dust.
So that's and then. But this is also what the book's about. I mean, we have talked a lot about startups and these are more like leadership, and business models. But it's also a lot about marketing. So here's Regis McKenna. Is that a familiar name?
Little bit.
Little bit. Very seldom when I show this book, anyone knows about it. But this is the guy who had the company behind all of Apple's marketing, from making the logo in the late 70s up till I think early 2000s. So they did a lot of marketing campaigns which you have seen, and like making the computer into a personal computer, for example. And then the famous commercial in Super Bowl where it's 1984. That's Regis McKenna, and his idea is that it's a lot about relationships, building relationships within the industry. It's like making a commercial, like advertising. That's like the 10th step you do. Courting retailers, talking, and like so. And they were also the marketing bureau for Intel. So Intel had these like seminars with like CEOs and boards where they sort of showed that this is what our product can do. You can try to fix it, and if you were really important, take it home. That kind of very hands-on, one-to-one marketing is like a playbook for that. He has some other books, but he's still alive. There's like cool interviews with him, and so the marketing is also very very important, and also because this relationship is also this that like no one knows what products will sell in 5 years in Silicon Valley, at least not in the 1980s. So you can know that the hardware will not be there, the software will be outdated, but the people will sort of be the same. So you can always invest in getting to know people, because that's what the industry is about. That is one of these takes.
And how does this then change over time? So this is sort of the 80s.
Yeah, this is sort of the 80s, and I mean, you will not read anything about any minimum viable products or network effects, or there's no internet here, barely. That's not there.
Yeah.
So if you jump back into like say the mid 90s, we had talked a little bit about this on the Paranoid Survive, which is about like how to sort of navigate very big changes without getting left behind, how not to get wiped out. And that I'd say is the theme of this one as well, the innovator's dilemma, which I think a lot of more people have heard about and read.
I mean, this is a typical thing that people talk about, and that's often referenced, isn't it? Oh, this is like an innovator's dilemma for this. I don't know how many have actually read the book.
It's quite a dense read. So this is like a business professor who was a sort of historian. It's about the diskette industry in the 80s, and it's about like many times in the 80s there's a company who has are the market leader, and then they make an innovation with a smaller diskette which is sort of superior, but they don't release it because it will cannibalize their current profits. So therefore an incumbent comes up and takes it. And the lesson from this is that sort of every company that wants to keep innovating must sort of have different divisions who do not share budgets, and the R&D division should not be known. They should do things that other people who control financials do not know, because otherwise you will sort of squirm innovation at an early stage, and therefore you will get buried. So like every company should sort of try to replace the current company from within.
Yeah, and allow yourself to compete with yourself.
Allow yourself to compete,
instead of being scared of this. And of course, this is what no one ever does. Everyone says we should definitely do this, and then no one ever does this. Because as soon as this comes up, it's like, well, we can't do that, obviously, because that would ruin the whole business that we already have, and then someone else does it, and then the circle continues.
Yeah.
Or at least that's the theory.
That's the theory. That's the theory. And that is like, I'd say this is, you often mention as Jeff Bezos' favorite book, and Google is sort of based on it as well. You have this like the Google graveyard, where you have like all the things that we have failed at, and you celebrate that. That you do because you show that to be an innovative company, you should always fail. I mean, if you have a year where you don't fail a lot, then that was a bad year because you did not innovate, sort of. And that is not that uncommon to think or talk about that like that today. But if you read like business press in the 80s, and like it's not like Ericsson celebrates all their failures, or that Intel does that. So that is the kind of the cult of failure, I'd say, is something which grows somewhere here. But then there's an interesting twist. I mean, there's a famous Harvard historian called Gilles Lepore who has had a grudge with Christensen, and so sort of looked at, okay, but how's the data? How is this diskette industry?
It's a very catchy idea.
It's a very catchy idea, yeah.
I think anyone who's ever worked in a company could recognize this, even in yourself.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
like,
definitely.
do I really want to do this new thing that might ruin everything
Thing
that
I've
I already
already
built
built,
up
yeah.
until this point? It's a very human.
It's a very human idea, and she shows sort of that these companies that he says sort of dies or loses out. No, they're still around. They're still doing things. They're doing different things. It's not. So and I mean, I have not studied it in detail myself, but from what I know, this book is basically bad history. But the thing is that it's used as knowledge, and so like Amazon or Google are partly built upon these ideas. So even if the research is so, whether it's
sketchy.
true or false, but it might be sketchy. That doesn't really matter if people in power uses it to sort of build the future. So like knowledge, or what we regard as knowledge, is important whether it is true or not. And
But would you say that was it ever true? Was it historically true, or it was just this was a catchy phrase? It has, you know, I'm sure there is an example of when this has happened, but in general, is this something that was true and has aged badly, or this was maybe arguably never really true at any larger scale? The innovator's
I don't know.
dilemma.
I mean, this is like a classic thing. Like we as historians, any academic, I mean, studied quite small things, and then you try to make it relevant by like scaling it up and saying this is. And even if this was true for like the diskette industry in the 80s, I mean, that does not make sense that it is true in all businesses through all times at all places. I mean, you cannot make that inference. That's a leap of faith. But this kind of knowledge is also, I mean, knowledge is also built on leap of faith. And the knowledge as we speak of it here is knowledge. What do people regard as knowledge? What do they regard as trustful? What do they sort of use as knowledge?
And
That's the historian's part, and it has a relativistic touch, of course.
if we look at this, because this is also the same idea, there's a lot of this in this pile here, where I think everybody, or a lot of people at least, would recognize some of the theories of it. At least you would have heard the lean startup. This is all. I mean, there's no one in Mink that has not read the Lean Startup. It sort of comes with the desk. I think, like, you need to read this. Now, whether that's a good idea or not is a separate point. But it's an example, and it's a bit odd. I think this is a good example we could talk about. Why has this become so successful? This is one of countless startup books, but this one has stuck, and it's not immediately to your point. I think about Clayton Christensen. It's not necessarily because it's true. This is a way of doing it. I mean, this book, for instance, talks about having a minimum viable product, which is, don't spend a truckload of money on something to then go out and figure out, does this actually work? But try to do the absolute least you can possibly do, then try it, does it work, and then make it again. This is a familiar sort of product development methodology. That's not necessarily truth. That's a way. That's a method of doing it. But it's interesting how this is stuck, because a lot of people, I mean, from my own experience, having seen countless companies talking about this method, the V is forgotten. They've made a minimal product. It was never viable. This was never, it never had any viability whatsoever, because the viability in that category required something which was so much more. You can't do a minimal viable product in every possible category, because you often mistake the V. A minimum viable product, in a sense, would be a car with 3 wheels. That's not viable. It's very minimal, but it's not a viable thing in that category. Whereas in certain categories, you could do it. So this is an interesting example. It's almost taken as startup law. But it's not necessarily true. I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying it's not necessarily true.
No. Then you can say, like, the Apple thing, which we talked about, might be a counterexample as well. A company which typically does not release, like, the minimum viable things.
Yeah.
Try something which is sort of path-breaking and very perfect.
I think exactly. And that's a very good example, I think, now, even for Apple, where, like, the DNA of Apple is very, very different. It's the complete opposite of that. Whereas you would say in the same sentence, MVP is the way that you develop a startup, and then you would also say, I'm an Apple fanboy. Those two have nothing to do with each other. Look at what Apple is doing in AI at the moment. You could have two completely contrarian takes on that. You could say, they are hopelessly after everyone else. They're not doing anything, not spending even a fraction in CapEx spending that Google, Amazon, OpenAI, all the others are doing. You could argue they don't know what they're doing, they've lost it. You could argue the complete opposite and saying they don't want to release an MVP AI product. They don't want to release a minimum. They're going to wait. They're going to wait and they're going to see what's going to happen. And when they release something, it's going to be great. Because as mentioned before, the iPhone was a demonstrably better product than the smartphone that I got shown the other day at the live pod, which was a smartphone, but it was not the smartphone that any of you have used and anyone that any of you are interested in, or even knew that this was an Ericsson innovation, because the Apple iPhone is the one. The Apple iPhone is the example of not having an MVP. So these two images, they live side by side somehow, and somehow are almost interchangeable, even if they are each other's direct opposite. Apple is not an MVP company, clearly very, very successful. And of course, there are examples of the opposite. Something like Uber, which started very much as an MVP and has now become a super global company, which has been very successful, but started in just like, I can't get a cab in San Francisco. That's how it had started. And having lived in San Francisco, I can empathize with the people making Uber, because it was absolutely hopeless. But it was a very, very small problem and is now a global phenomenon, and has now almost replaced sort of the taxi word. I'm going to Uber to something, which is a very unusual situation. We just came up with, I can't get a cab in San Francisco. That's the starting point. And what's the MVP for that? And that's how it all began.
And then we can, of course, think of like what changes between 1995 and 2010, for example. This is like, I think, also early 2010 book. I mean, sure, 1995, there is the commercial internet is very, very young. The connections are very fragile, expensive. Like the software game is much bigger 2010 than 1995, and a lot of things changes.
I think this is another interesting one, which I think has aged relatively badly. I think he would agree. This is Nir Eyal, Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, which is basically how to get people addicted to your own product. I say this because a few years later he releases a book which is the exact opposite of this. It's like how to not be distracted by things and how to not get hooked on things. It's like you wrote the book on how to do it, and then you wrote a book of how not to get distracted by getting hooked on things. So this is also something which was very successful at the time, has maybe aged less well. I'm sure the principles are there, but do you want to be hooked? You want to hook your customers, yes, but do you want to be hooked as a person? No. So that's how we wrote the other book.
And it's also built very much as this kind of MVP book. Like I think it's first a blog and then getting traction. I mean, some of these people, like I think Eric Ries as well and Irial are like not known for having started companies. They don't have names until they started to do things. And then they do things in public, like having a blog on how to make habit-forming products, and then it gets so popular. So then you sort of codify it into a book, and then it's like, because like books are, even if a lot of people don't read books, books have some kind of the object is important. I mean, if you write a book, you get invited places to speak about the book, even if people not necessarily have read it. I mean, this is this authority by proxy, that if you have given out something, and if you can say that this has sold 1 million copies,
New York Times bestseller,
New York Times bestseller, etc. But they have different. I think Hooked is like this kind of the blog turns into the book thing. This one is like the lecture turning into a book. I think Eric Ries has like educational things and seminars and like some kind of very good.
Exactly. I think he's more
some kind of like
contextualized.
Like, and often like these things are like local monopolies before they turn into global bestsellers. Like they are important. And there's other things like there's this book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Which is a classic like self-help literature book, which is written by, it's from like the late 80s, early 90s, and it's very big. But it was, the one who wrote it was a Mormon, so it was first very big among Mormons in Utah, and then like a couple of years later it turns into this global thing. But they owned the Mormon market first. And so if you look in under the hood on a lot of these things...
That's a contrarian go-to-market strategy.
Yeah.
Start with the Mormons and then everybody else.
But a lot of things actually in Silicon Valley, I mean, the Utah like division, there is also this division at the University of Utah in computer graphics in the early 70s, where you have both the creator of Adobe and Ed Catmull, the one who Pixar, the first movie. So there is this kind of if you go back into it, there's all these very small like departments which are sort of very elite and have some people who then 30, 40 years later are everywhere, but they were like, he was the one who made Toy Story. He made like his hand move. It was like big on a computer conference in 1972, and he was from the University of Utah. I mean, and the business division, I think Christensen is also a Mormon, for example. I mean, these are...
There's a theme here.
There's a theme. No, but I mean, in business history, I mean, don't laugh at the Mormons, actually.
Utah is the new Silicon Valley. Who knew?
Oh, at least one of these nodes. Like we know, like the story of Bill Gates, who had like access to a computer at a very early age, for example, in Seattle, because he had rich parents and he went to the only school in Seattle who had like access to a computer. I mean, there's a lot of these very historically connected things, like people who were in. It's not a coincidence, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. I mean, they were born in 54 and 55, I think. Like, there are these kind of clusters who are very important. And as an historian, I find this like the mapping and the puzzle of how do things get together. That is, I find it like fascinating.
But it's also largely unwritten. There's very little structure around. Well, I mean, this is a slice of your bookshelf rather than anything else. And of course, some things are, they manage to sort of add themselves to terminology, lean startup, as we talked about. This is another one, blitz scaling. You probably have not read the book. You probably have heard the term, just scale very fast. Some of these are going to, age better than others. Reid Hoffman, the tech executive who was named the most times in the Epstein files. I don't think this book is going to sell as well after that necessarily. So he's the co-founder of LinkedIn originally, but he's now at least temporarily fallen from grace. I don't think people get. But blitzscaling as a concept, again with Uber and other things, very familiar. So some of them, they survive themselves just by sort of terminology, and he'll be known for that partly.
And that is, of course, also another thing of these things that happens between 95 and today, is that these kind of, the companies that go for scale before profit, like you delay profit as long as possible, that is also not typical business history if you go to 70s or 80s. I mean, that's not how the game you played. And I find like that game of business, if you'd say, is intrinsically interesting. And if you look here, this was on the books that you put me on to, Björn. This is The Power Law. It's a history of venture capital.
It doesn't have the, well, it doesn't look very exciting.
But it is very exciting.
500 pages and quite a boring cover, but nevertheless. Venture capital and the art of destruction.
Yeah, and this is like a very thorough history. I'd say the best one I've read about the venture capital industry, how it emerges in the 50s and 60s and up till today. But also that is the different styles. Like, do a venture capitalist, for example, do you invest in people, or do you invest in products? Do you try to take a board seat or not? I mean, here you can listen to all these like the Kleiner Perkins and the Sequoia and Benchmark. A lot of things, and they play different games.
Yeah, and it explains just the business behind it, the basic business, which is then the power law. If you're not familiar with what that is referring to, we have a few venture capitalists here. Is basically the returns of a venture fund will be very unevenly distributed. You invest in 100 firms, probably you'll get your fund back, if you're good, hopefully many times over, from one or two companies, and then you'll get some money back on some of the most, but you will lose everything. That is the power law. Yeah. That's what the whole thing is. Then there's a lot of other stuff, as you can see in this book, apart from what I just said, but that's the Cliff Notes version of the book, but obviously a lot more context and how you can play that game. Yeah. But essentially, it's saying that is how this works. That is how venture capital works. And I think another comment on what you were saying before in the 70s and 80s, tricky to drive businesses that were losing money, there was no business model for that. No. And the business model for that today is venture capital. Yeah. That's how you do it. And before there's a venture capital industry, which is as large as that, it's insane to say, well, you should just lose money for the first 10 years and then we'll figure it out later. Like, well, that wasn't an option then because there wasn't enough money around to do that for enough companies. And as that asset class has increased, more and more people can have the same idea and say, well, I can just lose money. Yeah. If we look at these books, then this is a slice from your bookcase. would you say this is an example of the best ideas that have spread, or are there other reasons why these books specifically, and these sorts of ideas and concepts that we've been discussing, why they've become so widespread all over the world, even from people who, as we mentioned, most likely probably have not read most of the books on the table anyway?
I would say those are research questions. But I think one important thing is, of course, if you look at the size of like this one and this one, for example, or this one, it's digestible. I think that's important. They usually say that the good business books, you should be able to like pick it up on a Friday and then you have something interesting to say on Monday when you come back. And that I think is one part of like the format. While I mean this thing, it can be how good ever it is, but like it excludes a lot of readers apart from like this one. So that's parts. I think time is sort of the weighing machine for this kind of knowledge, I think, and usefulness. And there is the Lindy effect, that the longer something has existed, the more likely it is to stay around. So that if you read a book from 40 years ago, it's more likely to be around 40 years from now than if you read a book that came out yesterday. So like the time is sort of a weighing machine, which sort of makes the case for why it could be interesting to like read Only the Paranoid Survive in an age.
Yeah, and it also
because like I mean people have found it useful for some decades. They would likely,
I think if you're a new startup founder, also it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in some sense. It's weird to have discussions, go to meetups, pitch venture capitalists, and not know what this is about.
Yeah.
So you feel the need, well, I don't need to do it necessarily, but at least I need to read it. I need to know about it. I need to reference it. Whether I believe it or not is somewhat irrelevant, but I need to know it because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which means you talk about it, and then the next generation of people come in, and now they think they feel the same way as well. So it's sort of it's a spiraling effect.
That is of course like the network effect of books as well. Like if everyone in a certain world has read something, then it's more useful.
Yeah.
Then you get an additional social value of having read it.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, why like the hard part with and this go back to like the 0 to 1. Like the hard the book here about traction. It's like the hard part is to actually get traction, to get something that people use and talk about and stuff like that. But once you go there, then it's sometimes more like a time game. But going from and that's, I mean, the research world is much similar. I mean, it's very hard to become a classic, something which is in all the course lists that everyone references. That is really hard. But if you are, it's really hard to like sort of get wiped out because so many people have invested in it that it sort of has this self-sustaining logic. So in book marketing, there is this figure that the author's prerogative is that you should have 10,000 people who are legitimately interested in the topic read it, and after that you can quit the mission. You can stop marketing. Either it will live or it will die. Right. But until you have reached like a certain number of people, you don't really know.
Well, this is a 3-part series.
Yeah.
So the first one is then about sort of the beginning of the history here. Some book examples. I don't know if they're all recommendations necessarily, but they're here and available. The second one is going to be the 9th of March. We're going to talk about sort of the opposite of what is it like working in Silicon Valley. How does it work? How does some of these ideas be used in practice? And then the third one is more sort of how you can use this and sort of bring some synthesis out of all of these things. But we thought before we go, also leave some possibility for some questions before people run back to their 1 o'clock meeting in 11 minutes. So if you have any questions of any sort, or you need a firm book recommendation or something like that, here's a question.
Hi. Hello, my name is Alina, and thank you very much for the lecture. It was really interesting and really nice about the books. I have read only one of them, The Lean Startup.
You see? You have much to do until the 9th of March.
It's a big list right now. But considering also your expertise, which is like historical expertise and more like expert, I'm curious about how you see the evolution of Silicon Valley, because also if talking about the books, you don't have any books there which are like 5 or 10 years ago, and so most of the books you said is from 2010. So, and that's 15 years ago. So maybe some thoughts about how you see that progressing?
Sure. I'll start, and then you can go after. I mean, the historian lives in the past, obviously, by definition somehow. I think some of them is a bit early to say whether they're interesting books. I think actually the Uncanny Valley, that's a semi-work of fiction. It's sort of a biography, or it's somewhat. That actually is a much more modern take. Super good book, Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, which is more. It's about her experiences. It is written in a fictionalized way, but it is exactly what it's like living in Silicon Valley right here, right now. I think the lesson from that is less business oriented. It's more like, holy shit, is it this bad? That's the sense you get when you read this book. And after having lived there, the answer is yes, it is exactly like that book. The other sort of the classic thing is probably the Lindy effect that you said. Maybe they haven't had time to build themselves to that position. Right now, there's a huge race in writing the definitive AI book, which by its nature is going to be very tricky to tell. Is it very good? Does it age well? Because we don't know if it ages well until quite some years later. There's a lot coming out. There's no lack of books in the category, but they haven't really earned their position yet, I'd say, to say, like, is this something that everyone's going to be talking about in 10 years? I don't know if I have an example of something that you feel is sort of an instant classic.
I think this is like from 2023. I think this is an instant classic in the historical space of it.
Yeah.
And it's also like some of these books are like, of course, build on how it goes for certain companies. So there was this like the Netflix book, The No Rules a couple of years ago, for example. I mean, if Netflix keeps like being on top, then that has quite a chance, I'd say.
We don't have the biographies of Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, which is exactly.
No, the biographies are of course also in that category, and those are.
The Steve Jobs case is interesting because I mean, the legacy is set in some sense. What that's going to happen. Elon Musk still TBD exactly where that's going to end up. From both a positive or a negative sense. It's like he has many things left to accomplish, and so writing this tomb on Elon Musk's life could have been a bit early, considering sort of the span of his career and how much is left. Many things could happen. I mean, maybe is he going to Mars? Is he going to the moon? Is he going bankrupt? Who knows? Any of those things are theoretically possible. So maybe that's one reason why that's not there. But obviously, there's a great interest.
One can also discuss like the books. I think, for example, the podcast Acquired is sort of, in some senses, book quality. It's like a lot about researching how there are certain companies, and I think it's like had its 10-year anniversary now. I think there are some of these.
It's a very modern version of this. It's a very odd podcast.
It's a very odd podcast, but it has certainly reached some kind of tipping point in importance.
It's almost like a book in audio form.
It's almost like a book in audio form, and there are more listeners than readers. So that is.
It's probably a lowering of the threshold.
And if they ever wrote a book, or if Daniel Ek writes a book, for example, there are a lot of people who could, if they, like the David Senra podcast on founders, is also one of these guys that are like semi-bookish.
Waiting to happen.
Waiting to happen, or like if they want to, then that's a way to codify it.
Any other questions before we go? One.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. My name is Erkan, and I have one question that's maybe more for the historian, because like now we got an introduction of like 50 years ago, and like how we progress with the knowledge, the acquired knowledge, and re-innovation, re-destruction of knowledge, and seeing where new borders are. Do you see that maybe particularly in Silicon Valley there is a different focus on like how to innovate and predict future trends differently? Because I feel from a limited point of view that in the past it was more like, also like finding something and believing in it more. And today everything is a bit more driven faster, and also like trend watching on a globally sphere. While before it was, I feel like more like the Western trends and like seeing where we open up. Now we have like way more markets as like India and China coming in and being influential there. If you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, and that wasn't, of course, also up in the open. Like, globalization has been like one of the big narratives from like the 80s and onwards, together with liberalization and digitalization. And one could argue that digitalization keeps going, while liberalization and globalization might be on the decline. So that there's this, what happens if there be these clusters or like different worlds functioning in different ways? That's one thing of it. And I think like these voices from different places. I mean, when we speak about these things, Björn, you always say that like Silicon Valley is still so capital intensive that like so much of the actual like economic power is there still. Still, depending on what happens, I mean, it's not unreasonable to think that people look towards China or what they have done and how they have done it, and it's like a very different system, of course. And India as well. I mean, like the global gaze is important, but then there is this like, I mean, Silicon Valley was quite an unlikely global hub if you go back to like the 50s. Both Silicon Valley, or there was not the word Silicon Valley is from the 70s, and Stanford was not that important. It was more like Boston and MIT and that kind of, that's where it happened. And then the historians or sociologists have studied this. They argue that like the reason that Silicon Valley became so important was that it was so far away from the political and the classical power and the banks and the stuff. So it was like central but still a little bit rogue. And also, if you look at the field prediction, is that the next Silicon Valley will not be like Silicon Valley, or it will be created through different power spheres, because if you play the Silicon Valley game, then you will get beaten. You have to play a different game, like the hardware game, which you'd say argue that China is playing, for example.
I mean, this is a common narrative, of course. Everyone, and this is very common in the Swedish startup ecosystem as well. We got to learn from Silicon Valley. If you read Peter Thiel, that is the complete opposite of what he's saying. Do not emulate what Silicon Valley is doing. They've already won that game. Play a different game. That's what he's really saying. He's saying like there's no way you can what this book is about, all this capital intensity and all of those things happening in this environment, trying to replicate that here is a fool's errand. He would argue, and that's not to say there are no good companies to create and there's no trends to spot in other places. Quite the opposite. It's just that's probably not the method, because the Silicon Valley method wasn't taken from anything else either. It was something new. It was new there and then, and sort of the next version of that is probably going to look quite differently. So just trying to replicate it, which I think is what's happening to a very large degree. There's an absurd focus on quite a small geographical area. San Francisco alone is 7 times 7 miles. That's it. That's all it is. It's a small square with water on 3 sides. It's a very, very small place. And trying to derive how that ecosystem works is probably drawing the wrong conclusion. That being said, there's a lot to be learned, but not necessarily that we should emulate and do exactly the same thing. And I think that's what we're trying to go for in this little mini-series. So with that, I'd like to thank you, David, and thank you for coming. And if you think this is interesting, please come back the 9th of March. Yeah. I'm going to tell you about
your story,
how to run a company relatively successful, although with a very many close calls in Silicon Valley. So thank you so much for coming.